Welcome to another episode of Turning Pages, where we explore the power of books and the stories that help us grow. I'm your host, Mel, and today we have a very special guest joining us today, Ernest Ellender, the author of the profound book, This Is How You Heal from Painful Childhood, is here to share his insight and experiences. His work has touched the hearts of many, offering guidance and hope to those on their healing journey. In this episode, we delve into healing the inner childhood bonds and traumas that we may have, how to set healthy boundaries. So settle in and let's begin this meaningful conversation. Thanks for joining us. Ernest Ellender, the author of How to Heal Your Painful Childhood. What got you into this genre of the childhood wounds?
The genre specific, I guess it's just in graduate school. Even before graduate school, I was just really into the psychology thing and working with people. I got to work at a few clinics before grad school, but in grad school is when it really captured me, the focus on childhood stuff. Actually, it was more in grad school I was introduced to working with people for trauma, and initially it was just post-traumatic stress disorder. So I got to work with some like Vietnam veterans and some other veterans. I got to work with a bunch of women in the women's program at the Women's Trauma Recovery Program, and there is where I was kind of introduced to this idea that this awareness that a lot of people in adulthood who encounter traumatic situations and develop post-traumatic stress disorder had some childhood stuff that didn't set them up very well for handling adult traumas. So, when you look at what's a big precursor to adult post-traumatic stress disorder, it's childhood traumas. So that started to turn my focus kind of midway through grad school on the childhood stuff. And then when I graduated and started seeing my own clients, that just kept coming up, kind of screaming at me, to really focus on that, because it's just so much of our adult functioning seems to be like an automatic repeat of what we learned in childhood. So it just made sense to me to really focus on the childhood stuff, the patterns just figure out the patterns. Like how do you see consistently what's going on, and then how do we stop it from just continuing?
Do you think that we're, as adults, some of us are just blinded by the fact that we have this trauma, that it's being it's being overlooked and ignored?
Absolutely. I mean, very much so. Even when it's not necessarily a severe trauma type of situation, but it's these habits and interpersonal dynamics growing up that we just are so automated. We're just so automated to it that we repeat it in adulthood, and we don't realize that it's causing problems for us. So even if it's not directly tied to severe trauma, some people know, oh, it's a severe trauma, so it must be affecting me, and other people are like, oh, it's just little stuff. That doesn't affect me. Yes, it does.
Yeah. Well, what are the minor things that people may symptoms or behaviors that people may have that reflects childhood trauma that they're overlooking?
For one, I'm really interested in conflict resolution. That's
Okay.
been a real focus of mine for the last 2 years. So how does each family resolve conflict? And that is what we see typically repeated. So if two parents argue a lot and then it's not resolved, and then they just do the silent treatment for a couple of days, and then they start talking again and just pretend like that thing didn't happen, that's one way to resolve conflict, even though it doesn't quite resolve it, but it gets past a particular conflict until it comes back up again. So that's one pattern we see a lot. Another would be like a very one-sided. One side yells at the other one, and the other one kind of does a lot of passive-aggressive things to kind of get back. So very indirect communication, and we might not realize that that's what we're doing. So that our approach to conflict resolution is a huge one that we typically just repeat, and we can't really we've changed it enough to where it doesn't look exactly like our parents, but it's a lot of similar stuff.
So if you were to give advice to someone now starting off and trying to heal childhood trauma, what would be the things that you would tell them? Like, what approach would you tell them to take?
Oh man. Okay. Well, we do have to deal with reality, right? So when we're dealing with reality, there is the reality of resources. What resources do we have access to? So I mean, if you have good resources, good amount of money, and it's very well worth the investment in the beginning to get an assessment by a professional, somebody who's trauma informed. If you think that you have childhood stuff that's impacting your current life, which you probably are, which you probably do, it's great if you have the resources to contact a therapist or a trauma informed life coach, that type of thing, and just get their assessment and evaluation and referrals, their idea of what to focus on. And at that point, that can be a great initial investment. Now, if you have tons of resources, you can just keep going with that and see what they refer. And if you don't have a lot of resources, but you have a little bit, you can do that investment. And then if somebody came to me and we did like 2 sessions and they said, okay, all I have is enough money for 2 sessions. Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions or get a good understanding of where you're coming from, and then put down a list of books and activities, a game plan that we have that's lower cost that you can keep learning about these topics and apply it to your life. And at that point, there's just tons of books are really low cost, tons of amazing videos on YouTube, great podcasts like the one you're getting started here that focuses on those topics. So if you look out there, it's amazing the wonderful resources out there that are free or low cost. When you're not sure where to look, that's the real challenging part in the beginning.
In your book, you speak a lot on compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah, you speak a lot on compassion. I learned that recently. I decided to stop drinking alcohol completely. And one of the books one of the books I read, they spoke about compassion. So when I read was going through your book, I realized that you really emphasize compassion. Why is that so important for us while we're dealing with the inner child trauma?
Most of the trauma that we're talking about from childhood, it's interpersonal. So a parent or caregiver was not there in a consistently healthy fashion, and so there's this interpersonal disconnect that causes our interpersonal functioning to be problematic. So in that case, there's a very intense emotions there, and it's very typically anger at the other person in front of me or anger at myself. So we see a lot of childhood trauma survivors or people who had stressful, really rough childhoods either have a very self-criticizing, very harsh on self inner voice in there. Pete Walker's book, he talks about the inner critic. He coined that term. I think it's a wonderful term. It's this inner critic that just constantly hammering on yourself. Or somebody goes the other way, which is I'm the victim and you're the bad guy and everybody else is the aggressor and bad guy. And when either one is the case, either whether it's anger at somebody else or anger at myself, compassion is what comes in and gets us to start laying aside those intense, combative emotions and focus, and gets us to start getting in touch with the vulnerable, with the suffering of both people. So for me to heal, I have to be able to be easier on myself and learn how to love and have some compassion for myself. I'm so stupid. I should have done this. I could have done that. Yeah, if somebody had shown you how to do that, great. But nobody did show you how to do that. So how do you expect yourself to do that? Have some compassion for yourself. And even when your parent is lost in addiction or lost in their own suffering, it's difficult to really thoroughly heal if I cannot at least have some compassion for their suffering. Even if I like to be clear here, because some people are like, oh, you're telling me to just get over it and forgive. I'm not talking about forgiving even. I'm just talking about having compassion for. This person failed me and I'm upset about it. And I can also see that this person was in their own really unhealthy cycles, and they're not really loving life, and they're suffering, and they're not. We can do both. I don't need to forgive you. I can just have compassion for you from a distance, and that helps me have more compassion for myself. Wonderful when somebody can get to a point. One of the chapters, let's see, which chapter is it? Anger begets anger. Rule number 10, anger begets anger, violence against violence, and love begets love. We get into the concept of forgiveness in that chapter. And yes, it'd be wonderful if we can get to that point of loving myself enough and having enough compassion on the other person and seeing where they're coming from, and get to that point of forgiving them. But man, some of the traumas that I've listened to, when somebody is directly, physically, or sexually abused by a parent or an adult, the best that they can do sometimes, there's so much righteous anger towards that person. Sometimes for 10 or 20 years, the best they can do is come to have some compassion, not just to forgive them, but get them out of their life so that I'm not living in anger. So they get to this part of apathy, like, okay, I don't have to love you, I don't have to necessarily forgive you, but I'll just push you off into the world and you go do your thing over there. I don't want your negativity in my life anymore. Just removing the negativity, removing the anger, removing that hatred is enough to go really far. Because I get, their abuser may still be abusing other people. They may be in prison, they may be it can be too much to ask of somebody to just forgive. It's ideal, it's awesome, but sometimes the amount of suffering that they've encountered in others' hands, that's a little too much.
Yeah, because when I started my healing journey, I know that the forgiveness is really big in the spiritual community and the healing space and the self-development space. And I never really wrapped my head around forgiveness for some of the most harshful things that you've either experienced or heard someone else experience. And I'm like, I don't think it's something that should be forced upon us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anger. Go ahead.
Well, I would go one further. Sometimes in the process of healing, adult, child, and the adult is injuring the child. Well, as they grow up, they're both adults, but there's this feeling of feeling vulnerable, and it takes a long time for a survivor to go from feeling vulnerable or weak in relation to the other person to building the skills, building the self-love, building the stability in their home and in their relationships and their life. And once they get to a point of feeling very healthy and clean and strong and powerful, they get to the point where they feel more powerful and more happy and more harmonious than their aggressor. At that point, it can become more possible to be forgiving. But when you're still down here and the other person is this monster, it's really hard to just look at this monster and be, oh, I forgive you. That's, again, really hard.
What about boundaries when it comes to the parents?
Well, yes. Let's see. I'm looking at my cheat sheet here. Rule number 14, boundaries are confusing, so keep practicing better boundaries.
Okay.
We talk about cognitive boundaries. I like to use the cognitive behavioral triangle to understand things. The cognitive, that's the thinking-based stuff, emotional, and then behavioral. So we have cognitive boundaries that have to do with information, behavioral boundaries, and then emotional boundaries. And so when we look at each of those three, when I work with my clients, I like to look at just how toxic is a parent? Are they really toxic? Well, if they're really toxic, but you want to still have a relationship with them, then you can loosen up the behavioral boundaries a little bit, like by spending a little bit of time with them. But if you share too much information, then that information is used as ammunition against you. So you keep those cognitive boundaries really tight. You can talk about the weather, you can talk about food, you can talk about games, but you don't talk about your personal life of vulnerable stuff, because they don't know how to treat that information respectfully or stably or in a healthy fashion. And then also emotionally, it's very difficult for a child to not drop their emotional boundaries because they were kind of like DNA bound to want to have a relationship and to want to have connection with the parents. And that's probably the hardest one, to keep some emotionally safe boundaries, to where I'll laugh with this toxic parent, I'll smile with them, but I don't want to allow myself to let my guard down and drop my emotional boundaries and come to trust or these things if they are truly still toxic.
Okay.
So I can spend some time with them, but I have to be very aware of my how strong I want to keep my cognitive boundaries, how strong I want to keep my emotional boundaries, and how much behavioral interactions do I want to allow there. It's very difficult. Some people just do the all or nothing thing, like, nope, they're just toxic and I cannot be around them. And then others want to be around them. Okay, well, how do we be around them and meet them on their level for a safe amount of time, and then separate, regroup, and make sure that that's not negatively impacting your life?
Yeah, I think I know, well, for me personally, if I was to cut off a parent, it would be difficult because I would have a sense of guilt.
Okay. I was
Yeah.
wondering if you can say socially it'd be difficult, but it would be an emotionally difficult thing for you. The
Yeah.
guilt part, huh? So
Yeah.
is the guilt go with some kind of so the emotion of guilt goes with it might go with that cognitive statement of, oh, that's blood relative. You only have blood relatives. You should always be, love your parents. You should. There's lots of should statements out there, right?
Yeah. You should.
You should, yeah.
You should show up. You should be there. You
Yeah.
should call. You should do this.
Yeah.
And so I know recently I've been sort of setting some boundaries, but there is that voice in my head that says, "Oh my gosh, like you only have one father. You only have one parent." My mom lives in
Yes.
Toronto, but my dad is here, and sometimes I'm like want to set some boundaries, and I'm like, there's like a guilt that kind of weighs on me, but I know that in order for me to be a little bit more at peace, I need to have that boundary.
Yes. There's two approaches there. Sometimes I say, okay, well, I know you feel like you should because that's what society tells us. And then we do a little switcheroo where you say, okay, do you happen to have kids or anything?
I do. I have a son, and he lives with his dad in Florida.
And how old is he?
He's 16.
Yeah, 16. So I like to think of like like my little niece, she's 12 years old. If I think, well, I'm okay with just pushing through it, forcing myself to do it, and then I think, would I ask her to do the same thing? If somebody's being terrible to you, oh, you should just love them anyway, be around them anyway, because you should. I wouldn't tell my niece to do that. I tell myself to do that, but I won't tell my niece to do that. Some vulnerable kid that I love, I'm not going to tell them they should expose themselves to somebody who's consistently disrespectful, consistently unhealthy, consistently damaging to the person of who they are, So that's one approach. Switch it out. We're oftentimes people, adult survivors are very willing to sacrifice themselves, but they're not so willing to sacrifice children, they're people that they love.
Yeah, because with my son, I'm very protective. If he comes to visit, I practically micromanage his surroundings to protect him.
Yeah.
But yeah, when it comes to myself, I'm just like, okay, I could sacrifice this. I've been getting better though.
Yeah, and the other the approach to the should statements, that's considered a cognitive distortion if we use it incorrectly. So I think that's toward the end of the book, by the way.
Right.
If you're not quite through the book yet, with a should statement it's a distortion because it's based on opinions. It's based on judgments or societal beliefs. It's not based on fact. So you should, well, why? Who says so? Somebody is saying that because that's their opinion. It's not
Right.
fact. So we can switch it to if-then statements or to I want statements, but I like the if-then because it puts it into as close as we can get to if-then, to factual statements, cause and effect. If I do hang out with this toxic parent, then these are the results. These are the most likely results. If I do not at all, then these are the results. If I hang out with him or her once a month, then these are the results. And then you look at those results, the pluses and minuses, and then you're just picking from a very objectively rational, pile of consequences. Do I want this pile of consequences, that, or that? Let's remove the judgment and values and all that kind of stuff out of it, and let's just look, cause and effect. If I do have this person in my life, what's the effect? Oh, it's my mental health suffers, and if I don't, what's that effect?
Yeah.
Cause and effect.
In your book, you explained the, if you can just explain to us, PTSD.
Oh,
I think I'm saying it right. Yeah.
That's correct. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
Yeah.
But there was another abbreviation you had in there, which is chronic.
Well, complex.
Complex, sorry.
Yes. There's post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's the
Right.
official diagnosis that they, like in America, the APA, the American Psychological Association, identifies. And then there's this other concept called complex PTSD. It's similar, but it's different in the sense that they have, it's often from prolonged childhood stuff.
Repetitive.
And so it looks a little different. Repetitive, yes.
Right.
So in both of those post-traumatic stress disorder cases, there is an unhealthy chronic activation of our survival mode. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So we were exposed to something traumatic, something scary, and that part of our brain that turns on our survival mode remembers that it just happened, or remembers that it happened a long time ago, and that it does not want it to happen again. So it keeps reminding us that it happened, and then it makes us want to stay away from it. So those are the two main cluster of symptoms for post-traumatic stress disorder: re-experiencing of the trauma in some way, like memories, nightmares, physical, reliving it when you see something or smell something that reminds you of it. So there's a re-experiencing of it, and then an avoidance of anything that reminds you of it. So those are the two main cluster of symptoms. And then the complex part is complex. It's confusing because in childhood, let's say a child is severely neglected. Well, in adulthood, it's not like you got into a car accident and it's hard to get into a car. As an adult, they kind of fear losing connectivity or not making connections with somebody else. So they're just trying to have a relationship, and they don't understand why they're so emotionally reactive when they perceive some kind of little tiny insult or rejection or something like that. So it's confusing. It doesn't.
So that would affect your attachment style.
Yes, very much so. Yes, very much so.
Yeah,
pretty much all of the childhood, most of the childhood trauma stuff does impact the way that we attach to other people.
Yeah, I think being self-aware, I guess, when certain situations happen, how your body reacts would give you insight as to if you're dealing with some sort of repressed childhood trauma.
Absolutely. If we use that same triangle of the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors,
right?
We can be triggered in each of those realms, and we can kind of get a clue to what are our triggers by looking at all three of those. So for somebody, fear of rejection or embarrassment, certain emotions really trigger some people. So you can say, oh, that's the emotion that's difficult for me. Right? For others, you really feel it in the body. we pretty much always experience trauma or those re-experiencing symptoms in the body somewhere. But oftentimes we don't realize it. We don't notice it. But if we slow down and get tuned into our body, for example, some people really feel it in the shoulders, like their shoulders come up like this, to like they're getting ready to get hit. But they don't realize it because it's not like this. They're just elevating their shoulders, but they're doing that all day. So they get these migraine headaches. A lot of trauma survivors have migraine headaches all the time. And well, their shoulders are just constantly tense because they're carrying that trauma and their fears of these things in their shoulders. Others carry it in their stomach. Others carry it in their gut or in their pelvis. It's in different parts of our body. And so when we tune into that, we can say, wow, okay, my abs are super tight. I must be anxious about something. Okay, let me focus on that. So when you figure out what your particular triggers are, what your particular response to being triggered is, it's really nice. You might be holding your breath.
Yeah.
Sometimes we kind of hold our breath. Oh yeah, got to remember to breathe.
Yeah, I know for me, I noticed that if I heard someone arguing, my body would feel nervous. I'll start to sweat a little bit, and I'll feel the nervousness in my body. But that comes from childhood. But I realize it, and it's sometimes it's just the slightest thing, as just a loud noise out of nowhere, that I'm just sort of like, oh wow.
Yes, yeah. And a hearing sensitivity is one symptom common for complex PTSD, yeah, because when our body gets into survival mode, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? When our body gets into that mode, the blood flow in our body changes. So it pulls the blood flow away from our extremities. So when I'm in survival mode, I'm ready to fight or freeze or run away, the blood goes away from my fingertips, so my fingers get cold. The front of my brain gets cold. It drops a few degrees in temperature. And the blood goes away from the extremities and it goes to the chest cavity and our heart and the base of the brain that has to do with our senses, with muscle movement. So we get super strong, super athletic. And part of that is our hearing gets extra sensitive. So when you're in fight or flight mode, some people have the sensation of not being able to hear anything, but the ears are amped up. And so the ears are really listening for danger. But if you're stuck in that all your childhood, well, that part of the brain gets a little bit enlarged, stronger. So in adulthood, people who have grew up like that are just very sensitive to noises, to the chaos of noise and people arguing. A lot of my clients who have pretty severe CPTSD, like a baby crying on the other side of the restaurant, they have a really difficult time with that. Chaos, noise.
Okay.
Very common symptom.
I wanted to ask you about anger. Is there such a thing as healthy anger?
I believe so. Yes, most certainly.
Yeah.
I guess there's two forms of healthy anger. Like one is right away after somebody's been injured. That's normal. Anger does help us mobilize energy to do something. It's very proactive. So in a moment, it can be very good. It's activating. It feels better than the feeling vulnerable or weak or hopeless or helpless. So anger can be motivating and proactive and good within reason, right?
Yeah, because I know a lot of people bottled up anger because they're like, well, I mean, there's a difference. I get, you can't go around punching people, right? So,
Yes.
but we hold it inside of us. What is a good way
Yes.
to express that anger?
Very good. And that's the second. So sometimes people, working with people It's like they were from childhood so acclimated to having to be very submissive, very fawning. So they had to live in that fawning survival response. So it's as though they do not matter. They don't matter. Everyone else matters. They do not matter. And when somebody injures them or hurts them, they're like, "Oh, it's okay. It's okay." It's that person who doesn't seem to have an anger response. It's interesting to try to like, well, let's slow that down because I want to see some anger. I want to see that person get angry. Or, and it's a challenging thing sometimes to help them get in touch with their righteous anger.
What are some healthy ways to get in touch with your anger?
One is to do that same thing we already did, which is to imagine somebody doing that same thing to a child. To like, somebody doing that to you might be fine. You might be like, "Oh, that's fine, whatever." But imagine them doing that to a kid, to somebody you love, and like, "Oh no, oh no." And there we see the anger. Like, well, where's that anger for you? Where's that anger for yourself?
Right.
Just slow it down and focus on that.
The reason why I asked too is I wanted to know if there's anything physical that we can do, because I found kickboxing to be very useful. Okay. Yeah, to be very useful for my anger. Like somebody's like, "Oh, you're doing cardio." I'm like, "No, it's anger management."
Yes. Well, so I was talking about ways to make anger come up.
Okay.
To essentially teach healthy anger to somebody who is overly self-sacrificing and overly self-submissive, submitting. So when we do have a lot of that anger, and we want to manage it, absolutely. I'm a big fan of martial arts because that teaches us just punch and bag. Lots of intense physical exercise is most certainly a great way. But I like to say that it cannot be the only way, because then I have to exercise every day, several hours to exhaustion, in order to get my exhaustion to the level where I can't have anger. And we just can't do that. We can't do that all the time, right? So
it's like acknowledging that it's there. Is like yeah.
So I love martial arts for helping channel it into a constructive area in which, the team, like in martial arts, you and I are going to go against each other. We might punch each other in the face, but we both agree to do it, and we're both doing it in a way that we're very intentionally deciding on exactly how hard to go. So it's a communal, like a collaborative, socially good and structured thing, but we're both getting aggression out, even though we care about each other, So that can be constructive. But the other, besides that intense physical activity, is we got to slow down and see what's driving the anger. So we think of anger as an umbrella emotion that has these other emotions that are driving it. In other words, you don't just get anger by itself. We get the anger is pushed by something else. So we have to slow down, do our breathing, control breathing, calm down sufficiently so that I can think clearly. And then I can start looking for what is the emotion that was driving that. Was it embarrassment? Was it shame? Was it guilt? Was it, like jealousy? Was it indignation? What is the emotion under it? And then what was leading to that emotion? And if I can deal with that emotion, then a lot of the anger goes away. It's yeah. So that's, and we need to do that. I think we want to do that to get rid of the toxic level of anger, and then the additional energy from that anger was where we get it out with the intense activity.
Yeah, I guess for anyone, is it safe to say that if you're dealing with self-worth, lack of self-worth and self-love, inner childhood work is probably a really good place to start? Like, that should be the main focus, the core?
If specifically to address difficulty with self-love, that's a wonderful place to start. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, when we're talking specifically about self-love, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Like
All
like
right.
my book, I try to approach, there are 20 different variables. So, when approaching this situation, somebody comes in new, a brand new person comes in, we go through and discuss everything going on for them, their goals and everything. And then we want to see which area do we need to work on first. And very often it is that self-love, the lack of self-love. So yes, inner child work is a great place to start. But sometimes it might be boundaries first. Before we get to working on self-love, their boundaries are so unhealthy that they're putting themselves in dangerous situations and being involved with very toxic people, still in relationship with abusers and stuff like that. Well, we might need to work on that first.
Okay. The reason why I ask is I know I have some female viewers that are now stepping in to their journey. And with women, that's one of the things I know that we suffer with silently, because we know how to act pretty well,
Yes.
outside,
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
self-love, and whether we put up quotes or anything like that and put ourselves together. I know sometimes a lot of us we suffer silently, with the self-love and
Yes.
self-worth.
Yes. Yes. Y'all do a good job of faking it.
Yeah.
Look nice, put a smile on your face, and look pretty no matter how you're feeling, right? All those kind of messages in
Yeah.
childhood, yes. And so, it's really challenging.
Yeah. So
It is challenging. It takes a while to be able to do all that stuff, but to be able to slow down and focus on how truly your relationship with yourself. How much do you
yeah.
love yourself?
Yeah, and I know, even some of my viewers, they are, over the age of, well, some are like late 30s and 40s, or my age, 41. And we are single and realizing we've been dating the same person over and over again. And for me, I know for me personally, I had to do therapy, right?
So did I. I only recently figured this out, and I'm 51. When you said in their 30s or 40s, or like me, like, what? I thought you were in your late 20s, maybe, or 30.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's easy to have blind spots because, like we said, it's complex. It's confusing.
Yeah.
It's hard to when you're the one living it. It's very difficult to see from within it how
Right.
you're picking the same people over and over.
Yeah, and I was
You
picking
know.
the same attachment style. And so this was a couple years ago when I really started getting really heavy into my journey. And I know the inner childhood stuff is, that has been one of the most challenging areas in therapy for me. It was almost as if I was just avoiding, like, no, we can talk about this another time. No, I don't want to look at my baby picture. And then I also had, blocked out memories, like I couldn't remember.
So when they say let's break out the baby pictures,
Yeah.
was it that you thought that was silly, or was it emotionally like, oh no, what
I
was
think it was
challenging about it?
both. I think it was both because it was, for one, my dad doesn't believe in therapy. So I had to go behind his
Awesome.
back. Yeah, I went behind his back, and I, well, actually, I didn't tell anybody. I was just like, okay, because sometimes you hear, oh, that's a waste of time, blah, 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 whatever. So I went into it, open-minded and stuff like that. But then I had the same mindset, like, why are we going back in the past? I have this problem here today.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
I have all these issues going on right now. Why are we talking about this old BS? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
Like, no,
and
no, get
then,
serious.
yeah. So when I was just like, but then I realized there was a resistance to it. And I was like, okay, why am I resisting it? And, when I did some healing from abandonment, exercises, you have to write a letter to this inner child, and imagine this inner child and dealing with this. And I remember my first response was, oh, I don't like you. I actually don't want to deal with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that
And
sounds familiar, huh?
yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's yeah.
And actually that was, it actually made me quite sad. I was just like, why am I having this respond? You know?
Yes. Yeah. I yeah. Sometimes when people have, when like I don't want to talk about childhood and I don't want to talk about my trauma. It's like they don't, like the memory of it is so harsh, they don't want to touch that. And I
Yeah.
say, okay, that's fine. That's fine for now because, you know, when we repeat our cycles, we're doing it live now. It's like, oh, you think you left your childhood behind, but it's just repeating itself. And so if we can solve the current situation, then it's very reparative and healing. In other words, you know, if, for example, if your parents argued all grown up yelling, and you, of course, you are dating somebody who y'all argue and yell, that's out of the conflict. But then you go to therapy, and both people are like, okay, we're yelling, we love each other, but this yelling stuff just has to stop. Let's deal with it. And then both people, this is kind of rare because oftentimes both people don't want to go, collaboratively, but anyway,
Yeah.
if they do, and they get to this point where you learn how to not yell at each other and connect through mutual support, direct communication, mutual respect, self-love, self-advocacy. When you learn those things and you feel stronger about your relationship now and you feel like you're killing it, you're on top of the world now, you're doing it, then it becomes easier. Kind of like getting rid of the anger we talked about earlier. When you're feeling more strong and successful in your current life, then it becomes easier to turn around and talk about that old stuff. So sometimes I'll wait 6 months, wait a year, work on getting the present squared away.
Yeah. And I've actually seen some people that I know personally that have started to work on their inner childhood wounds, their painful trauma, a few men and some women. And just watching from a distance, I've actually seen a transformation of them when they're actively doing the work and showing up and doing it.
Yeah, it's exciting, huh?
Yeah.
To when you can really see someone's demeanor change, or you can see like the tension or whatever in their eyes when they think about them, when you think about their relationship with themselves or how they judge themselves, that tension fades away and there's some actual love and excitement and kind of peace. Oh, it's so beautiful to see, huh? Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, how can people get in contact with you?
Oh, let's see. I have my life coaching website, which is just my name, Ernest Ellender, Ph.D.com.
No, do you offer coaching internationally as well, or is it
I
only
do.
in person?
I do both. Yes, I do have like
Okay.
just virtual like this and everything. I might not
Okay.
be wearing this tie, but
Right.
I do do the virtual coaching, life and
Okay.
trauma coaching. Yeah, and then I have a website for my book, healfromchildhood.com. But it's also just available on Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will put the link for your book in the description below.
Oh, also Facebook and LinkedIn. I do have a
Okay.
face in LinkedIn, Ernest Ellender, PhD. Yep.
Well, I believe, okay, I'll have to tag you on the Facebook because I did put something up on social media, but I didn't put it on Facebook yet.
Oh, okay.
Is that
Very
right?
cool.
I do ask all my guests, what are 3 books you would recommend?
Oh, let's see. The first one would be This is How We Heal from Painful Childhoods, a practical
Right?
guide for healing past intergenerational stress and trauma. The second was just like, was Booker T. Washington's autobiography called Up from Slavery, an autobiography. I think that's the name of it. Amazing, really powerful book. I think I think Booker T. Washington was probably the greatest American who ever, ever. Like his curriculum and what he did to improve, like education and trauma, the trauma of the nation. I think his formula was the formula to heal our nation from that violent past. It's such an amazing book of forward looking healing. Oh, anyway, so up from slavery, yeah, and then the third would probably be a lot more humorous and decadent. Fight Club by Chuck
Okay.
Palahniuk. Yeah, I think it's a wonderful book and movie about a story about therapy. You know,
Okay.
this is a guy who's just trying to connect to people and doesn't know how to connect to people,
Yeah.
and so he tries all these crazy things to form connections with other human beings. It's like the modern cool way to do it, but then it just goes off the rails. Typical
Is
Chuck Palahniuk
Fight
style.
Club based on a true story? Or is it fiction?
Oh, it's fiction. It's
Oh,
based. It's
okay.
just based on the book by by
Oh, I love when people
Chuck.
actually recommend fiction books because I believe there's a lot of great stories that we can learn from in fiction.
Man, yes, yeah. Chuck Palahniuk writes a lot of deeply human. A lot of people who are out there. Just a lot of out there characters that are very like honest. They're very real representations of people just doing what they think makes sense, but it does not make sense.
And what are you currently reading?
Well, let's see. Oh man, right now I got a couple of. I got one book on gardening. I've been getting into gardening in my older age. I'm like totally nerding out on that. I want to do an indoor garden. Yeah, so gardening. I have another one on travel because I'm gearing up to start to try to. I haven't traveled for a couple of years while trying to finish the book, so it's time to go out of country
Okay.
again. You know.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
This has been wonderful. You're a
Yeah.
wonderful hostess. I really appreciate you. Thank you so
All
much.
right.